The legal rule of evidence called similar transaction is going to play a key role in this Florida trial as it did in the Salt Lake City trial.
The basic rule of law in the United States is that prior bad acts, whether they're convictions or not, are not admissible to prove that a person has done something in the present. That's the law. There's one exception to that, or there are a few exceptions to that, but the exception that you're talking about is what we call common scheme or plan. And that's an exception, and being an exception, the prosecution has to jump through a number of hoops before they're allowed to use that sort of evidence. The first thing they have to do is prove that there is indeed a common scheme or plan, that something that happened in the past is somehow related to what happened in the present. And I think that's clearly a very large hurdle as far as Ted's cases are concerned. Assuming that can be proven, that there is a common scheme or plan, then they have to prove that it is somehow relevant to the present charges.
It's difficult to prove. It's not acceptable courtroom procedure in some states, and it's difficult to control. A case in point is the Colorado murder of Karen Campbell, for which Ted Bundy has been charged. We flew to Colorado Springs to talk to the Colorado prosecutors. Bob Russell and Milton Blakey told me they asked to bring similar transaction evidence of 4 Utah crimes into Colorado court. One of the 4 cases, that of Carole Boone. The other 3, the disappearance of Deborah Kent and the murders of Melissa Smith and Laura Amy. Bundy has never been charged with the crimes of Kent, Smith, and Amy, and that fact alone made the legal rule of evidence of similar transaction peculiar, according to Bundy's defense attorney. But when I went to Salt Lake City and Murray, Utah, to talk to officials, they didn't try to hide from me the fact that they think all 4 crimes are related, although this hasn't been admitted publicly before.
Well, I think that all of the quote Ted cases that are still open, obviously. We're talking about Melissa Smith, who disappeared in 1974 and whose body was found up the canyon, and Laura Amy, a girl in Utah County who was also found missing around the same time, and her body was discovered down in American Fork Canyon. And of course the Debbie Kent disappearance up in Davis County, adjoining county, whose body's never been found. These have all been linked in some way to Ted, either by physical evidence or witnesses' testimony, and they were, I assume that all the jurisdictions still have those cases open, but they pretty well centered on Ted as the main suspect.
Bundy and his attorneys called appalling the move to have similar transaction brought to the Karen Campbell case in Colorado.
Here were all these cases that I was immediately linked with, allegedly, in Colorado. But it turns out that most of those cases that involved young women who were beaten to death and left nude in the mountains of Colorado occurred before I even left Washington State. They happened before and they happened after I was ever in Colorado. So I think that what we have here is tunnel vision. Even here in Tallahassee, there was a crime in the Tallahassee area that occurred in May of '75 that's identical to what happened in the Kiomega house. In fact, it involved the Kiomega sister. In May of '75, I was in Glenwood Springs. So what I'm saying is that we're really looking at this thing in a very prejudicial way. I mean, not we, you, or the general public is.
They claimed Prosecutor Russell was using the headlines of this unusual rule of evidence to further Russell's political career. Defense said Russell wanted to be district attorney, a job he did run for and now holds. The prosecutor claims the similarities include abduction, nude bodies, severely beaten, little blood found in those bodies, Smith and Amy wearing only necklaces. The defense claimed more things were dissimilar. The investigating authorities established that both Amy and Smith had been held captive for a period of days and weeks before being killed. Karen Campbell, on the other hand, was killed within 2 hours of her abduction. The defense further notes that to keep the women captive would have meant Bundy needed an accomplice, because Bundy has a firm alibi during those captive dates. He was on a hunting trip with his fiance's father. Neighbors of Bundy, when he lived in this apartment, also testified there were no indications that anyone was being held captive or living with Bundy during this time. Colorado and Utah authorities now add the names of Sandra Weaver, Kathy Hansen, Carolyn Sarkazians, Karen Roberson to their growing list of missing and murdered women. A coroner's report concludes that it is possible the same person or persons killed these women. At this point in our investigation, an interesting coincidence is documented. Another man was convicted of the murder of Karen Roberson and is currently serving time. He used abduction, handcuffs, and a handgun. It is believed this man was briefly investigated in the Carole Boone case, in which abduction, handcuffs, and a handgun were used. The files on these cases have not been closed in Utah. It's almost certain that the legal question of similar transaction will play a key role in this Florida trial, and if it does, one Seattle lawyer speculates it will be like opening a legal can of worms. It could be the basis of appeal, should that become necessary. Ruth Walsh for News 4.